Is it truly important to sow seeds on time, or is it a gardening myth? I will debunk it right away. It is very important to start seeds on time because it can mean the difference between having a harvest or no harvest. Why so? Because of this? No, not the frog. It is the 12 inches of snow that is surrounding it. Nothing would grow on this. There is something called as growing degree days, which is more important to gardeners in colder climate. These are the days when your plants grow best without the risk of being killed by cold weather. For example, here in Kansas, I have nearly 150 growing degree days. To make the most of these days and get more harvest from my garden, I need to have my seedlings ready to go in the garden at the beginning of these 150 days, which starts right after the last frost day in spring. This clearly means I need to start the seeds way before the last frost date. But exactly when? When I was a beginner gardener, I spent so much time going through so many videos and taking notes about when to start seeds, when to transplant, and at what speed would it grow, etc. It took a lot of my time. I know there are charts like this, but I wish these were more detailed when I was a beginner gardener. So today, I want to save your time by sharing when to start the seeds of these most common vegetables, when to transplant them, when to expect a harvest, and give you a visual aid to help with this process. There are two plants that are loved by everyone and need to be started in January, but I will list them later in this video because I want to start you with the easy to grow plants first. Kale, collard, mustard, cauliflowers, and cabbages are some of the most favorite crops gardeners love to grow. And some of these are very easy to grow. They all love cold weather and belong to Brassica plant family. It is good to start them 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost date. You will find this information on the back of the seed packet as well. The main struggle is to understand this information and act on it on time. Here is how to do it. For me, here in Kansas, the last frost date is around 15th April. So if I count 8 weeks before this date, it takes me to nearly to mid of February. 6 weeks would be the beginning of March. So I should start brassica seedlings between 15th Feb to 1st of week of March. So now I have a date range of when to sow these seeds. And this is a more clear visual aid to me. You can follow the same strategy. Just fill in your last frost date, which you can easily find on internet, and work the dates how I showed. I have these planning cards and sheet on my blog. You can get it for free when you subscribe. Link is in the description. If you do subscribe, the email with this sheet may end up in your spam folder, so do check there, and it may be delivered by the next day. I personally start brassica during the last 2 weeks of February because brassica has medium growth rate, so they need time to grow. All of these brassica plants can be transplanted when the soil temperature is above 45 degrees Fahrenheit and plants are about 2 to 3 inches tall. I keep a meat thermometer for this, and usually in the beginning of April, I would poke the thermometer in the garden where I plan to transplant them. Generally, 2 weeks before last frost date is good time to transplant brassicas in garden, which for me is around 1st of April. Brassica plants can take cold, but until the temperature starts to stay in 40s. Covering them with row cover or greenhouse plastic will help them establish better and keep them alive. I will link a video in description about different ways to protect them. The maturity timeline is slightly different for these brassica plants. The leafy ones like kale, collard, and mustards are usually ready to harvest in 55 to 75 days. So I start harvesting kale leaves in May. But cauliflowers and cabbages may need little longer, about 70 to 100 days to be ready for harvest, and I expect them to be ready around mid-June. Lettuce is another favorite spring vegetable. Starting it indoor about 6 to 8 weeks before last frost date will do. It grows very fast. So I usually start it in beginning of March. You can see how knowing your last frost date can clear up sowing schedule so much. Last frost date is the date after which there should be no frost. So cold should not kill your plants after that. The loose leaf kind of lettuce can be harvested in 50 to 60 days, and I like them more because I can start harvesting the outer leaves by end of April. The ones that make heads will need 70 to 90 days to mature. The one issue with lettuce is it bolts fast and turns bitter when temperature warms up. There is one plant that doesn't get bitter and doesn't bolt easily when it gets hot. It is chard. I will write on the same card as lettuce to save paper, and it follows same timeline as lettuce. I started indoors at the same time as lettuce, about 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost. So beginning of March for me. It can take cold weather, so transplant it out in April. And you have salad leaves ready in 50 to 60 days. Root crops are next because they love cold weather. Radish has the fastest turnaround. They are ready in 30 to 40 days for harvesting. You sow them about 4 weeks before your last frost. So I start in March. I personally like to direct sow a batch outdoors every weekend during March and April. This practice is called as succession planting. Each of these batches will mature one after another, which helps to distribute the harvest over a longer period of time. I do interplant radishes with other crops like peas. I have been gardening for 5 years now, and peas have never failed me. So they are my favorite. Sow peas around 4 to 6 weeks before the last frost. So again, first week of March for me. I used to start them indoors, but now I direct sow them into the garden. This saves me indoor space and results are almost same for me. So while the pea plants take 60 to 70 days to mature, the radishes that I interplant with them are already harvested. I do the same with carrots and beets also. I would sow radishes with them, and while they both take their time to mature, I get radishes from the same space. Carrots need longer to mature though, about 70 to 80 days. You can succession plant them as well. So start about 6 weeks before your last frost date and plant a container every weekend. I usually start in second week of March and direct sow them. Direct sowing means I do not start the seeds indoors. I start them outdoors in containers or raised beds, and they will grow there for the whole season. There will be no transplanting for these. Carrots are finicky to germinate. I will link in description a method I use to help it germinate. It has worked really well for me multiple times. Beets, on the other hand, are not finicky at all. They germinate quick and mature in 50 to 70 days. You can follow the same succession planting technique and sow them every week, starting 4 to 6 weeks before the last frost. I direct sow it in mid of March. Radish, beets, and carrots do great in containers. So save your raised beds for more nutrient-needing plants like cauliflowers, tomatoes, etc. That was a lot of spring crops. But imagine this, if you plant all of these, you will be harvesting one or the other thing from April to all the way into mid of June, which in my mind is pretty cool. What happens after June though? That is when tomatoes come in. But not if you do not start them on time. Most of the summer crops need longer growth period to produce vegetables. Tomatoes need to be started indoors, 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. I personally start tomatoes on 1st of March. That date gives me the right balance between having my tomato plants not too big before I transplant them. Otherwise, I will have to repot them multiple times, which is unnecessary work that I don't want to do. Tomatoes won't tolerate frost at all, so be prepared to have some grow lights set up ready. I will link my budget-friendly grow light setup video in description. To be very safe with your warm weather seedlings, I would suggest to wait an extra week or two after your last frost date and then transplant them. I personally transplant my warm weather seedlings after 10th of May. even though my last frost date is around 15th April. Most of the time, tomatoes will start producing from mid of July till all the way into fall when the first frost kills the plant. Unlike tomatoes, not all summer crops need to be started so early, mostly because many of them are fast growers, such as bush beans. The seedlings grow way too fast, so I personally start the first batch indoors around 1 week after the last frost, which for me is the 4th week of April. Transplant it after the first frost date because it won't survive frost. After that, I direct sow the next batch about 3 weeks later and the next batch 3 weeks later. So I keep succession planting them until July. Bush beans grow fast, so you will start getting beans in 50 to 60 days from sowing. For me, the first batch starts producing in July and then the other batches follow up to give me harvest all the way into fall. The same bush bean plant won't keep producing all season long. If you have limited space, skip bush beans and grow pole beans instead. I prefer noodle pole beans because they perform better in my partially shaded garden and they don't suffer from any prominent diseases. The same plant produces all season long. I do not start pole beans indoors because they grow very fast. I prefer to direct sow them outside about a week after my last frost date, so usually in the last week of April. One thing to know is that pole beans start producing a little later than the bush beans. They take about 70 to 90 days to produce beans. So I would expect beans around end of July from them. After that, it keeps producing all the way into fall. Cucumber and zucchini are next on my list. Both are fast growing plants. I do not grow much zucchini because my family doesn't like it. But I would follow the same schedule for it as I would for cucumbers. I start seeds indoors nearly 2 weeks before my last frost date. So it is usually the first week of April for me when I start it. If you start it too soon, the seedling becomes too big and takes a lot of space. I don't feel it worth the hassle. Transplant it after the first frost date because it won't survive frost. Again, for cucumbers, I play it safe and transplant around May 10th. The smaller size varieties will start producing earlier in 50 to 70 days, so I usually start getting harvest around mid of July. It is a good idea to succession plant cucumbers if you love them and want to grow a lot of them to make pickle or relish. With succession planting, you can get bigger harvest. So when you transplant these seedlings, direct sow some cucumbers at the same time for next batch. Pumpkins are almost in the same category. They grow too fast. So start seeds indoors about 3 weeks before the last frost and transplant outside after the last frost date. They do take longer to mature, about 90 to 120 days. So I would get a harvest sometime in August or after that. Pumpkin is long game. Wait, did I forget peppers? Actually, not. I said in the beginning that there are 2 plants much loved by everyone, and those need to be started in January. Pepper is one of them. When the seed packet says 10 weeks, they really do mean it for peppers. In fact, it is better to give it an additional 2 weeks because the pepper seeds are slower to germinate. Also, peppers do need a certain number of growing days before it starts to make any pepper, which is why it is important to start it a little earlier. So, working backwards from my last frost date of April 15th, 12 weeks brings me to mid of January. I personally start mine indoors around January 20th. I play safe and transplant them outside about 2 weeks after my last frost date, so around May 10th. Eggplants follow the same pattern as peppers, so follow the exact same steps I mentioned for peppers. To maximize the overall produce from your garden, it is important to place these plants in the most optimal position in your garden. To achieve it, you need a garden plan, which I have covered in detail in the video linked on the screen. Check it out next.